Hi, my name is Omesh and I'm the president of the Real Ale and Cider Society. And today I'm going to show you how to brew beer, and depending on the size of the equipment that you can afford, it's pretty much the exact same process. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing, say, 25 litres or in this case 330 ml. I'm hoping that in the future we can all brew together, because that's what we usually do at the society. So once a month we usually come together, brew some beer, and have a really big event. But obviously we can't do that now, so we're hoping to take all of this online. So we'll be making some kits at some point, but I just want to show how easy it is you can do with anything you have at home. So right here I've got some grain. So we'll be making a red ale today. You don't need to buy specialty grain. You can even just get oats from Sainsbury's and use that. You're going to have to figure out the sugar concentrations and stuff, and I'm actually going to try do a recipe to try and figure that out for everyone. So this right here is a mixture of crystal malt and red Cara. I've got some mosaic hops here. So these hops are really fantastic, very fragrant, and for small batches like this I actually keep my hops in the freezer, and they're good for pretty much ever. And so all we're using is 2 grams, and so you just buy a little pot and you can have as many goes as you want doing this. So I've got about 1 litre of water boiling at the moment. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a cheesecloth bag. So I'm trying to emphasise how we can do everything at home, and I'm just putting all of the grain that we can inside this bag, and we're going to essentially steep them like we would tea. And so what that enables us to do is use those sugars for fermentation. But what's really great is every single type of grain we use will actually impart some of its flavouring, so you can make the perfect beer for your taste buds. That's why I love doing this. Super easy to do. It only takes about a day's worth of work, and then you just let it sit for 2 weeks and you have your favourite beer every single time. Great. So as we were saying, we're going to take all the sugars out of the grain, and we're going to use the sugars to ferment them to make the alcohol. So what I've done here is I've heated a pot here to about 70 degrees. So what we want to do is we want to steep it in about 65 degrees for around an hour. Now the reason why I've chose 70 degrees is as soon as I drop this in the water, the temperature of the water is going to drop significantly. And so what we want to do is slowly get the grains soaked in. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the bag, and what that will let us do is it won't let any of the grains fall out into the water, because we want to keep it as clear as we can. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that all of the grains are getting enough water surrounding them. So you don't want any of the grains to just remain clumped together. So what you want to do is you want to be able to extract all the sugars as you can from it, because that's essentially what we're going to be fermenting. So you want the water to be able to pass through as much as the grain as possible. So we've got the cheesecloth there just to keep the grain from making the water too cloudy, but it's thin enough to allow the water to pass through. And so what we call that is a mash bag. And so what we have here is, it's currently at 62 degrees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the hob back on, and it's basically just going to be a game of turning it on and off to keep it around the 65-70 degrees. And we want that for about an hour. We've extracted all the grains out, and usually if you want, you can measure how much of the sugars that you have extracted to determine the alcohol concentration. I'm not going to go through this in depth. All I want to do today is show you how easy the overall brew day is, and not go into too much jargon. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly take the water out, and so we wanted a nice dark red beer. We've got some of the liquid out now. I don't know if you can tell, but there's not as much liquid in there as we were expecting, and that's because the grains have soaked in a lot. Now what we do usually is pass water and recirculate it, and that's getting all the last sugars and all the extra water and things like that. But what I'm going to do is just squeeze the bag here slightly, and what we have now here is 350 milliliters of wort. And now wort is essentially the sugar water you get from the grains. And what I'm going to do is add a tiny bit more water, and that's because the next step is to boil it, so that we can add the hops and extract all that flavour out and have essentially what our beer is going to taste like. So adding extra water means that as the water is evaporating, as it's boiling, we want to maintain the same sort of level of water when we ferment it. Another thing to note is if you do end up checking the sugar concentration, it's too high of a percentage. So for example, instead of 5%, you end up with an 8% beer, which has happened to me before. What you can do is dilute the water further until you get the percentage you want. So you can move from an 8% beer to a 4% beer by adding water at this stage, which is perfectly fine because the boiling step that we're going to next will sanitize this water as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add it until it goes to about 450, because I'm expecting about 100 mils of evaporation from my setup. And so what I'm going to do is pour this back in. Once this starts boiling, I'm going to add my hops. Now, in general, when we're boiling hops, we have different stages that we boil. So the longer you boil the hops, the more bitter flavour you'll get. Now, the less the hops have been boiled, the more aromatics you'll get from the different types of hops that you have. Now, because we have such a small quantities, we're not going to be doing the full hour boil. In fact, we're only doing half an hour in total, and with 2 grams. Any longer of a boil and we'll overhop the beer. So I put the hops in this bag. Now, the reason why I've done this is once the beer is done, it's going to be very hot. And so rather than having to mess around with sieving it and cleaning other bits of equipment, I could just pull this bag out and there'll be no bits left in there. It'll be a nice clean beer. So this is just to save time and cleaning. You don't have to do this. You can put the flour straight in. You'll just have to sieve it up. So you want to get it a nice simmer like this. You don't want to have it over boiling. So this is perfect simmering. Now, the reason why you don't want to overboil it is once it comes out of the container, that sugar water is so hard to clean up. So just a nice roaring boil for about half an hour. So it's been about half an hour, and as we can see, it's gone to about 300 mils. So we could have added a bit more extra water, and at this point we can add a tiny bit more before it's fermented because it is very, very hot. But what we're going to do is just pour it straight into our fermentation vessel. So whether you have a massive 25-30 litre fermenting bin or just a simple mason jar, what you want is you want a nice enough headroom so that when it starts fermenting, what's going to happen is it's going to build a layer of foam. And you also want enough room that when it starts to pressurize, there's enough room for the gases to go. What I would recommend is getting something that will have a valve. So for mason jars, you can buy these. They're very, very simple. You just screw it on top, and this valve will let the CO2 pass out as it's fermenting. So once the beer is cooled down, we want to pitch our yeast, and that just basically means put the yeast in. So for this, we're using an English ale yeast, which means that it's going to be slightly dry but not overly dry. It's really amazing how much of a difference yeast can make. You can have the same batch of beer and use different yeasts and you'll get slightly different flavour profiles from all of them. So it's a very interesting thing to just play with in general. But for such a small batch such as this, so we're not even going to use, in fact, I'm going to take away some of that yeast. We're only going to use a very tiny amount because this yeast is super, super active. If the yeast becomes too active, even with the airlock, it will bubble over and it will pressurize way too quickly. So we want a very, very small amount. And our yeast packets for beer usually come enough for a 25 litre batch. Now, obviously, this isn't a 25 litre batch, and so those packets are very, very small usually, so we only want a very, very tiny amount. And sometimes you can tell that a beer hasn't fermented is if you taste it and it tastes like appley, that's dead yeast and no fermentation has actually happened. So once you've left it for 2 weeks, essentially it needs to be in a warm environment, 15 to 20 degrees. And you want it to be, especially if you have a glass container like this, you don't want to be leaving it on the countertop. You want it to get as little sun as possible. The light from the sun will break down some of the beer, and it will, it will taste really foul. So keep it in a dark room, 15 to 20 degrees for 10 days, but most likely 2 weeks. And if you're not sure about it, leave it for slightly longer. You'll be able to smell the beer, and what will happen is you might see a tiny ring of yeast, and that's just it having bubbled up slightly. And what you'll see is the yeast has actually settled down at the bottom, and that's how you know that it's ready. So this is the beer, and what you essentially do from here is usually move on to second fermentation. Now what that usually requires is bottling the beer and putting enough sugar in there for it to second ferment, and the CO2 released from the second fermentation, instead of being released through the airlock, will get trapped inside the liquid, and that will cause it to become fizzy. What you could do as well is, if you have a soda stream, I haven't tested this out, but you could probably try the soda stream as well and drink it straight. So when you're bottling a beer, what I recommend is get one with a flip cap top like this. You've over pressurized them. They're a lot easier to control. You're less likely to have these explode. Overall, you shouldn't have any problems as long as you use good containers. Put only a tiny bit of sugar, and also the amount of sugar depends on the style that you want. These will all be listed in the recipes, and if you are uncertain, please do email us beforehand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour the beer into this bottle. It's similar with the normal fermentation. You want enough head so that the gases are able to expand out from the liquid and it has space to move, but then it will go back in. So make sure you leave about 1 inch of headroom, and then again you can leave this for a few days. Some people leave it for 2 weeks. I would say check up on it, especially with these bottles. Once a day, maybe open it up, see how pressurized it is. If it's not as pressurized as you want it, leave it for a few more days. Then put it in the fridge and enjoy it. So we make all types of stuff at the Real Ale Society. Any fermentation project that you would like, whether it's, hey, I want to learn how to make a stout, I want to learn how to make perry, I want to learn how to make kombucha. We have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or just email us. I'll have all the links down below. We'll be answering as many questions as we can, any place where you contact us. So